All right, so happy to be joined by Andrea Adelson of ESPN.com. Her latest piece, or one of her latest pieces, titled "This Time at UCF, Scott Frost Won't Need to Catch Lightning in a Bottle," is on ESPN now. I'll link it here in the bio of this particular video. But Andrea, first off, thanks for taking some time to join us. Always excited when I see you sniffing around UCF. It's always a good time when I see an Andrea byline at UCF.
I appreciate that. It's great to be back at UCF. I kind of said to Scott when I walked in the office, like, gosh, does this feel really familiar? Because I'm having flashbacks. And oh my gosh, I can't believe it was 8 years ago the last time I sat in the office with you. It feels like yesterday.
Well, yeah, we're going to get to that, but let me start here. Let me just kind of back the clock up just for a second. July 1st, 2023, UCF officially joins the Big 12. If I had seen you that day and I had said to you, "Hey, Andrea, in May of 2025, you're going to be interviewing UCF head coach Scott Frost," what would you have said to me?
I probably would not have believed you, quite honestly. I really thought Gus Malzahn was going to work here. I thought that was a good hire. I thought it was the right hire at the right time, considering the transition that UCF was about to make into the Big 12. I really thought his experience as a Power Four coach was going to help. His ability and knowledge of what needed to be done on the offensive and defensive lines. Every coach that's made that transition from Group of Five to the power level always says that's the most important thing. And I think we saw that in kind of flashes, but never really consistently enough. So I really thought UCF was set up, but then obviously, as the last couple of years or seasons have shown, it just wasn't working. And it's not a surprise to me, though. I will say this, that Terry Mahaj went back to Scott Frost. That was such a special moment in time, not just for Scott, but for the UCF community. And it felt like the football fandom here in Orlando and UCF needed a jolt back for excitement, for the passion that we saw in those seasons that he was here. And so I guess that would be the like, if my answer is like 1A, I would have been surprised that there was a coaching change. 1B is, well, if they did make a coaching change, not necessarily surprised at Scott Frost. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, we talk on the show all the time. Like this was the home run hire. I don't think there could have been a hire that would have gotten the fan base more excited than bringing back Scott Frost. And you mentioned obviously covering him back in his first tenure at UCF 2016, 2017. When you walk into that office and you sit down with him again last couple of weeks, what did you expect, I guess, to maybe hear from Frost or see from Frost? And how was he different from maybe what you remember or recall from working with him, back about 7, 8 years ago now?
Well, that's a great question. I had a chance when he left UCF to go to Nebraska to actually visit him multiple times while he was at Nebraska, because it obviously wasn't going well. And I had a pre existing relationship with him. And, every time we talked, it was, we're this close. We're about to turn a corner. We're about to turn a corner. All those gut wrenching close games that they lost. I think it's what, 5-22, if my memory is correct. And
Yep.
in one score games, you kind of felt, and even the fan base too, they just wanted to give him every shot plus 10 more shots and then 10 more shots after that, to get it right. And so when I sat down with him this time at UCF, I was digging a lot about how are you different? How do you feel like you're different this time around? And he really did not want to talk about Nebraska. Like, he's like, I appreciate that you want to ask me that. I'm not going to answer it. I'm not going to talk about it. And I was like, but one more, Scott. Hold on. Like, one more. We know each other for a long time. I feel like I can dig a little bit deeper. I think there were like little kernels in there in roundabout ways from other things that he said. But I think that he learned first and foremost that he needs to be in a place where he can be completely happy. And that was not the case at Nebraska. And I think when he was at UCF, he was happy, he was content, and he felt like his life was good. Now, in terms of what I thought I would hear, I kind of expected to hear what he said. I did not think he was going to sit down and pour his heart out about what happened at Nebraska. I didn't think that he was going to go deep on how that changed his life, because it has to change you in some way when you go back to your alma mater. And that was the home run hire for Nebraska.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work. And now it's hard to even go back, right? Hard to even go back for a reunion. Hard to, I tried calling him several years ago for a 25-year anniversary piece on the 97 split national championship. Did not want to talk about that. So, there have been, I think, a lot of hurt feelings over what happened there. So I wasn't necessarily expecting him to open up about that. How did I find him different? I think he's just has more perspective about where he is in his life right now. I think maybe his priorities are a little bit different than they were the first time around. And I think the one thing that's the same, though, is he is completely determined to win here the way that he was the first time. That to me has not changed. I just think the age, the wisdom, the perspective that you gain when you have an experience that doesn't go your way just inherently makes you different.
Yeah, one of the quotes from the article he says is, "I know I'm a wiser person and a smarter football coach." Did he give you kind of any examples, or did you sense in him kind of the maybe where he's matured a little bit, or where he's different from the Frost of maybe the Nebraska age, or even from the UCF time?
That's a great question. He didn't give me concrete examples because, of course, I did ask, well, how are you different? And again, like, Scott is not a guy who's going to be super introspective and go deep on his what maybe other people think are some of his flaws or where he feels like he's gotten better. We didn't go too deep there, but I think a lot of that has to do with the coaching staff that he surrounded himself with the first time around, and I think making different hires that can support him here at UCF that maybe were different when he was at Nebraska. I think understanding the players better in terms of where they are, meeting them where they are right now in this era of college football. He got a small taste of that at the end of Nebraska. So I think that's another area where he has just better understanding and knowledge over how to deal with the players. So to me, those are just like a couple of examples. And I also think just, the way that he handles adverse situations, the way that he believes now more in terms of like the perspective of the importance of family and making sure that his kids are happy and he's doing things in that way. I don't think he didn't have kids the first time around at UCF. And going through what he went through with his dad passing when he was at Nebraska, having his kids there, I think also changed things a little bit for him in terms of like big picture, which is why we heard him say some of the things that he said at the press conference about being happy, right? Making sure
Right.
that you're happy first and foremost. And I know the headline, I'm glad you mentioned the headline, the lightning in a bottle. A lot of that has to do with the fact that UCF doesn't have to be perfect and then pray for a chance to make a playoff, right? They win the Big 12, they're in, at least the way that it's set up right now. We know that there's potentially going to be changes
Sure.
somewhere down the road, but I do think there's part of him that wants to recreate that happiness that he had the first time around here and the way that he felt about coaching and the way that he felt about coming into work every single day. I don't think that happiness existed for him in Nebraska because there was all of that pressure involved in that job at the place where you went to school, at the place where your head coach is now kind of still around and you want to please him and make him happy. So I do think there is a little part of him that kind of wants to make it go back to the way it was the first time around, just in terms of what his happiness is going to look like and feel like.
Well, in the article you mentioned his first day on campus, the second time, December 8th, the introductory press conference. He talks about the whirlwind that day was and getting up early and flying across country. And in that press conference, I thought it was interesting. He talked about he was happy at the Rams. He kind of liked what he was doing, but said he would only come back to coach for this job. What do you think UCF was so important to him? Because he probably could have had offers or maybe even stay in the NFL for a while. Why do you think he decided that this was the opportunity right now to come back to UCF? Why do you think he wanted that challenge?
So I asked him that repeatedly because this is a different era of college football than what it was in 2016 and 2017 when he first took the job. I mean, the transfer portal. And I did ask him, like, do you think if the transfer portal existed the way that it does in NIL, that you would have been able to keep the 16 team together headed into 17? Absolutely not. Or even parts of the 15 team headed into 16. So I kept trying to get into his head. You got so many college coaches leaving college to go to the NFL, which is where he was. He made the opposite decision to come back into college. And I agree with you. He did enjoy being in the NFL. He enjoyed that experience with the Rams. I talked to Sean McVay, and he talked about what a great asset it was to have Scott on their staff, not just doing a bunch of different things for them, but just another perspective of a head coach, having kind of sat in that chair. Sean and him could kind of go over some situational things that only a head coach maybe gets on his desk. And so, that was one of the things that stood out in my conversation with Sean. And so I think that Scott had just kind of accepted, all right, I'm going to go the NFL route. I'm going to try this. I'm going to see how it is. He really enjoyed it. And he was going to kind of look for potentially OC jobs here in the near future. But when UCF called, it kind of, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but he went back to what it felt like to be here the first time around and how happy he was, how fulfilled he felt. His wife was happy here when they lived here. Orlando's a great place, and you don't have the pressure of every time you're going out to eat, you're recognized all the time. I'm sure closer to campus, yes, but it's not the way that it was at Nebraska, where he just could not ever go out anywhere because it's a flood of people and they've got the phones out and the cameras and everyone wants a piece of him. And so I think he liked that part of being at UCF, but I also think he felt like he had to bring it back. It was hard for him to see what's happened here over the last couple of years, that the program is not where it was when he left it. And I think somewhere deep inside of him, he felt a responsibility to be the one to show like, no, 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 no. We can win here. I proved it before, and I'm going to prove it again in a Power Four conference. He doesn't feel like UCF is that far off. He praised the foundation that Gus Malzahn kind of laid to get the program where it is. And I think we all know the financial challenges that kind of came with the last couple of seasons and making that transition. And so Scott was very complimentary of what Gus had been able to do. But I think he feels like UCF shouldn't be a 4-8 team. And I know what it takes to get UCF back to where it was. And I want to accept that challenge. And he wanted to, I think part of him wanted to prove like, I'm not who I was at Nebraska. I'm who I was at UCF. And so I think a lot of that went into his mindset, but there were a lot of conversations. This was not a slam dunk yes right from the beginning. Scott really had to think about this, had to think about whether this is something that he really wanted to do. And at the end of the day, he felt like this was just the right opportunity at the right time.
Well, let's talk about the angle from Terry Mahaj, UCF athletics director, who is often maligned by the fan base, Andrea, largely because he's not Danny White, right? Who was the AD when Scott Frost was here and helped UCF kind of get to that precipice in 2017, and now currently at Tennessee. A lot of positions of power, Andrea, as you know, they like to hire their person, their guy, their coach. And Scott Frost is kind of a throwback to the past of UCF. What does it say about Terry Mahaj that he kind of dips into the past and gets, quote unquote, somebody else's guy to come lead his football program? What does that say about maybe Scott Frost or their connection between those two, or Terry Mahaj in general, that he's willing to take a risk and kind of dip back into the nostalgia play, if you will, to bring back Scott Frost?
Well, I just think it speaks to the urgency to get UCF football right. Because we all know that UCF football is not where it needs to be. And so when you're losing the fan base, right, when you're losing the excitement that has surrounded this program for a long time, that's problematic, particularly in this era when you need to have your fans invested. You need to continue to build with the donations and the fundraising. If you've kind of lost that, you're in trouble. And so I think he understands that Scott brings this magic with him. That yes, it existed in 2016 and 2017, but you said it yourself, the excitement from the fan base for Scott Frost, because everybody remembers what it was like, and everybody understands and realizes it should be like that. It shouldn't be 4-8. It should be 13-0 or 12-1 or even 10-2, right? Because that still gets you a chance to play in a conference championship game based on the way the Big 12 has gone here over the course of essentially its entire history, right? So I think it says that about him. But one of the things I didn't realize during the conversation I had with Terry was there was a conversation several years back with Scott about coming back as the OC under Gus. Gus told Terry, would you mind calling Scott? I have no problem with Scott coming back here to be our offensive coordinator, which again, as you mentioned, coaches who like doing the play calling and then ceding some of that responsibility to the former head coach who was here during the glory days, right? I'm like, wait, well, you're telling me Gus was okay with this? He said yes, Gus was okay with it because again, I just think it speaks to that special relationship that Scott has had with the fan base and continues to have with the fan base. So I thought that was interesting. And that kind of laid the groundwork, quite honestly, for Terry knowing I'm going to call Scott again because Scott was like, it's not the right time. It was right after Nebraska. I need some time away, which obviously is understandable because of everything that happened. But Scott spoke very highly about his time at UCF. And so when it came time to start calling candidates, Scott was right at the top of his list. And Terry had hoped that Scott was now more willing to take a look at it after a couple of years away. Time, right? Perspective. And he called other candidates, but as you said, there was only one that could galvanize the fan base like this, but you're also taking a risk. And it is a risk because of what happened at Nebraska and the differences in college football now. But I'll use that in air quotes because he's won here before. And so I think in his mind, and I think he says this in the story, it's not really a risk because they've already seen it happen here before. So why not again? Why not have this something like the magical 2017 season happen again? I will say this though, both Scott and Terry were like, let's just be clear. Like nobody's saying we're going to go 13-0 in like
Yeah.
year one, right? Like, and I'm like, okay, year two. That's what I said to Scott. He's like, okay, yeah, no pressure. I'm like, well, it was year two last time. But I think they both understand that yes, you can flip a roster really quickly in today's college football world. But what he's trying to do is not flip a roster for like a year or two. I think Scott really is committed to being here beyond 2 seasons. Now, I sit here now and say that things could change, obviously, but I didn't get any sort of sense that he's in it for the short term and he's looking for the next big thing. And I think that's always been kind of the issue at UCF is when your coach does have a lot of success. Oh gosh, who's going to take him? Well, now UCF is in a power conference, right? Like, and he was at Nebraska. Maybe it didn't work. Maybe this is a much better place for him for a whole bunch of reasons. So I didn't get any sort of sense that like he's going to be 1 or 2 and done, that he's committed not just for a good year, but for a decade of good years.
Well, if Scott Frost is favored status at UCF, he's probably only second to Mackenzie Milton, who Scott Frost
Yes.
brings back to bring on the coaching staff. I know you had a chance to talk to Mackenzie as well. I know you've spent some time with Mackenzie. I know you all have a pretty close relationship. How do you project Mackenzie as a coach? He's obviously spent some time at Tennessee as an analyst. Now as the first full-time coaching gig under his former head coach, Scott Frost, at his alma mater. This seems like a dream for Mackenzie Milton. What was your sense of talking to Mackenzie about how happy he is to be back at UCF, and what kind of coach do you think he'll be for the Knights this upcoming year and hopefully future years?
Yeah, I mean, he is over the moon excited, although he did say it's still kind of weird that they're working together now as opposed to like taking orders. Although sometimes Scott will come into the quarterback's room and he is, taking orders a little bit. But I'm just going to give you like the perfect kind of encapsulation for why I think Mackenzie's going to be a great coach. And I've thought this for a long time. So you see that football behind me. This was I was a guest coach at the Florida State spring game when Mackenzie was at Florida State the one year that he was there. And so I've got the play sheet. There's like 10 very basic plays on it. And now I've got to call like a really good play for the personnel. The personnel was all walk-ons, right? I was not allowed to call plays for the starters. This was like at the very end, the walk-ons are getting in. Let's have the journalists call some plays. So I walked over to Mackenzie. I'm like, you got to help me out. Like, I cannot lose this. Like, I have got to win. I have got to win. Which of these plays is going to work? And he points to one of them and says, this one, call this one. And of course, went for a touchdown. So that's like a very small little, he coached me up. And, but in all seriousness, the relationship he had with Jordan Travis there at Florida State and like as a student coach with him, even though the two of them were competing for that starting job that year in 2021, Jordan credits Mackenzie for helping him grow and develop as a quarterback, helping him film study, see things that maybe he wasn't getting before. And I think a lot of Jordan's growth is because of Mackenzie Milton. He had a great time at Tennessee. I saw him a couple years ago before a Tennessee game in his first like ever game there. And he was thrilled to be back with Coach Heupel, who he also has learned a lot from. And so, when Scott kind of saw him at this all-star game, which I mentioned in the story and a couple years ago, and was like, man, it'd be great if I got back to UCF one time. And Mackenzie's like, well, yeah, let's like hope that'd be amazing. And then when Scott calls him, it was just like, well, yeah, of course I'm going to come back to UCF, right? Because I think they both feel this responsibility. I talked about Scott, but I think Mackenzie does too. Like it hurts when the program that you have helped take to a level falls back, right? And Mackenzie played here. He don't want to see the struggles that
Yeah,
UCF has kind of gone through, right? So for him and the relationship he's always had with Scott has been a father figure to him. It was absolutely, what do I have to do? And Mackenzie has always wanted to be a coach. Once the injury happened and knowing he probably wasn't going to have a professional career, he set his sights on, what do I have to do to become a coach? I mean, even at UCF, with Dylan Gabriel taking
sure.
him under his wing, right? I mean, we've always seen this out of Mackenzie, and the coaches have always praised his ability to help coach his teammates in that quarterback room. So he's excited, and I think he's going to do fantastic work here at UCF.
Andrew, I think one of the themes that we've picked up on from this staff, this team, is a little bit of a chip on the shoulder mentality,
Mm-hmm.
right? Seems like Coach Frost has that. Seems like Mackenzie has that. A guy who you didn't quote in the article, I don't know if you spent time with him, Alex Grinch, who's obviously had a tough run at
Yep.
defensive coordinator position, chip on the shoulder. Do you get the sense that this is a coaching staff and kind of a team, kind of a rebuild with a chip on the shoulder, with something to prove, and that Coach Frost is looking for like-minded folks both in his his coaching staff and on the field to kind of have that same sort of mentality of chip on the shoulder and let's fight for everything, let's earn everything from that standpoint?
Absolutely. I mean, UCF thrived best when they were an underdog, right? I mean, when nobody was kind of believing in them in 2017. I mean, even in 2018, even though they were favored in the majority of their games, nobody wanted them to be in the playoff. Nobody wanted them to be, at the top. And so you always had that mindset and mentality. Once you get into the power conferences, though, right? It's like, well, oh, we're like one of the power teams now. Like, where's the underdog status? We've actually arrived, right? And so I don't think that's how Scott Frost and Mackenzie Milton and a lot of the staff, as you mentioned, and some of the players feel, right? I mean, there are still players on this team that weren't recruited by the teams they felt should have recruited them, right? You're always going to have that in any program, any team. But Mackenzie certainly had that when he was a player here. Scott, obviously, his playing career was a little bit different because of where he was. But I just feel like the mentality of UCF as a program, believing in themselves as underdogs, it always has helped lift them to higher places. And I do think there's a part of Scott, as I mentioned earlier, that feels like he's got to prove that he still knows how to coach. And I mean, Terry and I talked about this extensively because I asked him that. I'm like, do you feel like Scott has something to prove? Because his last stint, everyone just kind of thought he was bad because it didn't work at Nebraska. And that was supposed to be a great hire, and it didn't work out. And he said, anytime you don't have success, there's always something inside of you that feels like you've got to prove it to yourself, to others, that you can still do it. And so Scott didn't say that out loud, but I certainly do believe that there is part of him that's like, I don't forget how to coach. I know how to
Sure.
coach. I know what I'm doing. My system and my scheme works. And it's going to look different than what it looked under Gus. There's no question about that. But there is a confidence and belief in what they're doing, and it's fine if nobody believes in them. And I think they probably prefer it that way.
Well, look, the vibes are high off the field,
Yeah.
right? Again, everything couldn't be better. However, this team still actually has to play on the football team come the
Yeah.
fall. Did you get any sense of expectations? I know he's been very one of the things I found really telling, Andrea, and you've seen millions of press conferences. Every time a new coach is introduced, he or she gets in front of the podium and they slam their fist and they go, "We're going to win championships here. We're going to be a championship team." To this day, I do not believe Scott Frost has said the word championship as it relates to
Yeah.
UCF in the second time around. So he's doing a very nice job of trying to quell expectations and keep folks in a good spot. But what do you expect, or did he give you a sense of what he expects from this football team? Again, 50 something new players, having the transfer portal, still questions at quarterback, a rebuild
Right.
offensive line, wide receivers that are still young, a whole new defense. Have you had any sense what he expects this team to look like on the field, or what he's striving to have this team look like on the field?
Yeah, it's a great question because that's what everybody wants to know after, well, what happened at Nebraska? The second question is, well, okay, how is it going to look? How are we going to do? And he did not want to talk about it. He did not want to set any expectation. And I'm glad you pointed that out because you're absolutely right. He has been so good at avoiding setting what he thinks this team could be. And I think there's a reason for that. I think it goes back to people expecting right away 13-0, right? Because that's how we left it. And automatically that's how it should be when you can just turn your roster over real fast. I mean, look at Kurt Signetti. Look at what he did. He flipped over a roster and boom, playoff. I think he's been very careful and deliberate in making sure not to set expectations because of the past. And when you do turn over a roster like that, so much of what is predicated on the field goes back to what your locker room looks like. And I had that conversation with Mackenzie too. I was like, when you're in this era and you've got a revolving door of guys, right? It's not like when you were here and you've had that core group that kind of laid that foundation and went through the tough winless times. And then you're at the mountaintop. You have guys who are cycling in and out every year. I'm like, how do you get that chemistry that's so important to any team like you had in 2017? And he's like, you know what? The players ask me that all the time. Like, he's like, the players want to know, what do we have to do? How do we get that chemistry? Like you all had. And Mackenzie just goes back to, you got to work. You got to put in the work. Like, you have to be around. You have to be accountable. You have to reach out to your teammates. It can't just be like, I'm in for workouts and then I'm gone and nobody sees you, the rest of the day. And so they've really been trying to hammer that home in terms of establishing that culture of what it takes to have that chemistry to be able to win. But I think because there are so many question marks at so many of the important positions, obviously starting at quarterback, as you mentioned, offensive line, scheme change across the board. I don't even think that the staff has a good idea yet of what this is going to look like because it's also new and they haven't settled on their quarterback yet, right? So, and by the way, they haven't gone through a Power Four schedule themselves as part of UCF.
Yeah.
So the expectation of, okay, we think we know what it's going to look like, and certainly Scott coached at Nebraska and Mackenzie at Tennessee and Grinch at Oklahoma and USC and all these places, right? Like, yeah, okay, they've like, but not at UCF when you've turned the roster over like that. So I do think there's a bit of an unknown there in terms of what that's going to look like week to week. And Scott even mentioned that to me as well. The grind of having to go through this type of schedule, at least for him at UCF, will be new and different.
Yeah.
They didn't really have to do that, the first time around. So I think it all leads to, I don't know what to expect. I'm expecting a team that goes out and plays hard and plays well on offense. And I still also have some questions about Alex Grinch because, of where he's been in his past. But I do think that chip on the shoulder is hugely important. And we've seen UCF be extremely productive on defense at various points over the last several seasons and get guys in the NFL. So it's not like there's no talent. And that's one thing that Scott wanted to emphasize. There's talent on this team. It's just a matter of, well, now how do you get a team together? Not just a collection of talented players. How do you make this a team? And so I'm looking forward to it. I know I already know that I'm going to be there for the North Carolina game. I know that's shocking for people to hear that I'm going to be there for the North Carolina game. But I'm looking forward to seeing how it looks because quite honestly, I don't even know what to expect.
Let's zoom out a little bit. Obviously, in this current age of college athletics, there's a whole lot going on. The House settlement, is that alive? Is it not alive? No one really knows anymore. Tennessee passes laws. Everything's kind of up in arms. But I found this quote interesting by Coach Frost in your article. We moved to a fancy neighborhood. We got a job that's going to pay us money over time. We're going to do well, but we're stretching a little to be there right now. Where do you get the sense of where UCF is at, just in terms of NAL, in terms of contributions? How well positioned, or how maybe not well positioned, do you think the Knights are currently as we head into this 2025-2026 kind of academic year?
Yeah. I absolutely made sure to ask both Scott and Terry that question because in previous conversations that I had with Gus Malzahn, I know it was a difficult financial situation, particularly when you're not getting your full share from the Big 12 in order to join the Big 12, right? And that obviously hurts. Like, forget about NIL and fundraising. when you're not getting the same amount of money as Oklahoma State and those guys, it's just going to put you at a disadvantage. And I don't think there's any way to argue against that. That's just the reality of what the situation is. I know there's been a transition with the UCF collectives and trying to get people on board, all pulling in the same direction to make sure that everyone's aligned. And I think UCF is there now. At least that's what Scott and Terry had to tell me when I asked about the number, the rev share number, which is 20.5 million. Terry told me that he felt good about the fact that they'd be able to get there eventually. They're not quite there yet. Maybe they are now. I talked to him a month ago. But I don't think there's any question that the excitement of having Scott Frost back has helped galvanize some folks from a fundraising perspective. I think with the addition to the stadium, the renovation to the stadium, and more fans coming to games, I think certainly they feel like that will help. And now getting the full share as part of the Big 12 will help as well. So it wasn't as dire a picture as maybe Gus Malzahn had painted a couple of years back in terms of what they were facing financially. But T. Boone Pickens, right, at Oklahoma State, like, how do you even compete with that? Whether you're UCF or Cincinnati or, you know what I mean? Like, whomever, that's hard to compete with. Baylor money, right? Baylor money's really hard to compete with. They just have a lot of guys who have made a lot of money in oil in Texas and are willing to donate Texas Tech. I mean, the amount of money that Texas Tech has gone and spent because of a benefactor, it boggles the mind when you look at how much they've spent. Now, UCF is not there. I think people understand the reality of why UCF is not there, right? Obviously, it's a younger program, still trying to develop the boosters and the donors beyond the same folks who donate. But where Oklahoma State and Baylor and Texas Tech have been able to develop this over time, they've also got benefactors who are billionaires who don't mind spending whatever it's going to take. And so, yeah, that's where you're at a little bit of a disadvantage. But Oklahoma State, last time I checked, was 3-9 last year, right? So it's not like making sure you have a Team Boone Pickens is going to put you over the top. You know, UCF feels really good about where they are financially in terms of how competitive they can be in the Big 12. And I think probably better than they felt since they joined the Big 12 about where they are. But in terms of what that's going to look like after 1 year of rev share, because again, this is 20.5 million every single year and will increase because that's what market value tells you. And then you can have the ability to add the NIL on top of that. Yeah, they're going to have to continue to fundraise and be better every single year to be able to keep up and field teams that can be competitive from a financial perspective.
I know you cover the ACC a lot, and so I cannot let you go without asking this question. When I saw the tweet that Gus Malzahn had agreed to become the offensive coordinator at Florida State, I had to check 3 or 4 times to make sure it wasn't a fake tweet, like a fake Adam Schefter account or something.
Right.
Turns out it was real. Obviously, I know you spent some time in the ACC. I know you spent some time, with Florida State. What do you think that's going to look like? How do you kind of anticipate, Gus Malzahn moving into the offensive coordinator role for a Florida State team that had a down year last year? Mike Norvell made a ton of changes. They've been active in the transfer portal, right? Tommy Castellanos comes in from Boston College to be the quarterback, former UCF guy, who was there under Gus. How do you project Gus Malzahn, offensive coordinator of Florida State, to go?
I don't know, because I honestly am trying to picture how this is going to work. In fact, I was talking to some of my colleagues recently at the ACC spring meetings in Amelia Island. I'm like, how do you guys think this is going to work? Because I can't figure it out in my brain, like just logistically, how this is going to work with Gus calling plays when Mike has called the plays at Florida State his entire time that he's been there. And so in conversations I've had with both Gus and Mike, like they feel like they're on the same page in terms of what they want to do. Herb Hand came over with Gus as the offensive line coach. And so in my view, I feel like Florida State is going to look similar to what we saw from UCF a year ago. They went in the portal to bulk up the offensive line, which was a huge liability for Florida State a year ago. So Gus feels really good about the guys they were able to bring in because they have a ton of starting experience. Obviously, Randy Pittman came over as well. And so he's got guys who are familiar with his scheme, the way they like to run the football, Castellanos as well. And so he had nothing but good things to say about Tommy. Tommy is happy to be back with Gus, left UCF for an opportunity to start, and got that at BC. Didn't quite work out with Bill O'Brien, different scheme. I think Florida State's really going to use his strength in his legs and being able to run the ball. That is where they believe they can be better than they were a year ago. And when you look at their best years, which were in Travis, he was mobile and he was gaining yards running the football. So I totally expect them to do that this year. I still have question marks about Tommy, whether he can be efficient as a passer. He's never been efficient as a passer his entire career. In fact, ranks as one of the worst in terms of efficiency in the whole entire Power Four. And Florida State revamped their receiver group through the portal. So I have questions about how the passing game is going to work. I feel good that they'll be able to run the ball because of what we have seen with Gus running the ball at UCF. They don't have a dynamic back like RJ Harvey. They just don't have a dynamic back on the roster. They got a true freshman. They're hoping can be a dynamic back for them, but you just don't know with a true freshman. You have no idea. But I think Gus is happy that he doesn't have all the head coaching stuff on his plate, that he can just focus on calling plays, because I'm sure it drove you guys crazy that it would start out he's calling plays, now he's not calling plays. But he's going to call plays again. But no, I'm not going to do it. But no, wait, hold on, I'm just going to do it. No, I'm not going to do it. And I asked him about that, and he's like, this. I feel like good about the responsibility that I have, and I think Mike Norvell needed things off of his plate because he was taking on a lot of the responsibility on his own shoulders as the play caller. And the fact they have a good working relationship from their time previously at Tulsa, I think helps. They've always had a bond. But going back to what I said initially, I have like ideas of how I think this is going to work. I just don't know that it's going to be as successful as, people may anticipate, particularly because Gus hasn't really been innovative as a play caller in how many years? I mean, let's be honest, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he was known as the innovative guy when he got into college, but there was a reason, even though he was beating Alabama at Auburn, that he was let go at Auburn, right? The offense just kind of seemed to take a step back. And I know there were major issues with quarterback position this past season, and UCF could run the ball, but really couldn't do much of anything else. I do think Florida State will run it, but whether that's enough for them to win more than 7 or 8 games, I'm not convinced of that just yet.
If you had to guess right now, do you see Gus Malzahn ever being a college football head coach again?
I'm gonna, if I were to guess, and you're putting me on the spot here, I'm gonna guess no. Because the last few seasons with all of the extra stuff the head coaches have to deal with, it really did wear on him. He didn't like the portal stuff. The fundraising stuff was hard at UCF because for a whole host of reasons, and all those extra things that go beyond calling plays and coaching. I don't think he wanted to deal with that anymore. Now he could just be, selling me a bunch of lines because he knew it wasn't working out at UCF, and I might as well get out to be a coordinator and not get fired, right? Like, I'm sure there's probably some of that too. But I've talked to multiple head coaches who've kind of gone out of it or taken a step back or gone to the NFL, who are just like, I didn't want to deal with all the extra stuff that being a college football head coach entails anymore. And also, he talked a lot about his wife, Christy, wanting to be closer to their grandkids. And now they're a drive away in Tallahassee from Alabama, where their grandkids live. And, how her getting sick here and almost dying really changed his perspective on what's important. And he made it sound like part of this move was to be closer to family so that Christy could be closer to family so that they could spend more time with them. That's what he says. And I've got to take him at his word. So based on what we've talked about, I feel like I can't see him being a head coach again, but who knows? You get that itch, right? Scott Frost is like, well, I'm going to do it again. If Gus says I'm going to do it again, I won't be surprised.
All right, last one. Fill in the blank for me. This season for UCF football will be a success if blank.
I feel like I'm going to give a cliche here. and say, if UCF plays and starts one quarterback the entire season. Now, that's a cliche. I know that's a cliche. But so much of the success that UCF has had in its past has been when they have had a quarterback who is good to elite and is the starter for the entire season, right? Don't have injury, you don't play musical quarterbacks. I'm not sure. Whether it was Blake Bortles or Mackenzie or, fill in the blank, right? So, that's what I will say. And I hope that doesn't sound like a cop out or a cliche or anything like that. But the quarterback position at UCF has been so vital. And you've got Mackenzie Milton and Scott Frost, 2 former quarterbacks who are basically in charge. You cannot get quarterback wrong, right? That's the one thing. You cannot get quarterback wrong. So that's why I'm putting it all on the quarterback. Sorry, whoever the quarterback will be.
I don't think UCF fans would argue with you at all. Her latest is called "This Time at UCF, Scott Frost Won't Need to Catch Lightning in a Bottle." It's Andrea Adelson from ESPN.com. Andrea, thanks so much for taking the time to join us, and hopefully we can catch up with you soon. Maybe we'll catch up with you before that North Carolina game and see what the storylines are at that point. I can only imagine.
I wonder. I don't know. Thanks, Adam.
It's
great being on with you.
Thanks, Andrea.